Alright, me. It is sometime in December. And a couple days ago, we finished wrapping production on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Now, this is the musical version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, so this is not the exact movie, nor is it the book. Very specifically, I'm not sure how I'm going to credit this, because it's based on the Roald Dahl book, but then the book is by David Gregg, and then Scott Whitman, Mark Shaman worked on the music, and lyrics, and things. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to credit this, but that's that. I was the assistant stage manager for the show. Yada 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 yada. Nothing too exciting there. Yeah. You know, certainly not the thing that I was most excited to do in the world. I've been fairly open in my life. I'm not a huge holiday person in general, but especially Christmas. I'm not a huge Christmas person. And this kind of fits into, it's kind of Christmas, but it's not explicitly Christmas. It's kind of more of like a Thanksgiving, Christmas type, just winter vibes in general. So yeah. Interesting in the fact that it was a very rushed and condensed process, because we started while Rocky Horror was still in not even just production, but was still rehearsing. And they started with all the Charlie stuff. And the way it ended up working out was that, like, Rocky Horror ended. Then the next weekend they had the Limelights project, which is theater centered around minors, and getting them into theater and giving them roles and things that they would normally not be able to access because they're younger, and therefore they're competing, usually they'll be competing against adults who have much more experience. So this that was the next weekend after Rocky. And then we had Tech Weekend, and then the shows. I think that was the layout. And so we only had we had another weekend. So we had basically a week in the theater. And then it was just a rushed feeling thing. And we opened the Friday after Thanksgiving, which that meant that we didn't have rehearsal the day before, which then just threw everyone for a loop and was concerning for a lot of people. But we made it through, had a blast with it, enjoyed it. Anyway, that's all the production stuff. In terms of the writing and show itself, right, it's kind of this weird mix of where, I have not seen the movie version. I've not read the actual written version by Roald Dahl. But it's been many years since I've seen the movie versions. But it's very much this kind of weird thing of where this musical was clearly geared towards kids, but then also very much geared towards, we know that this is a long musical, and we know that there's a lot of stuff that's just happening. And so we're going to throw in a whole bunch of adult humor, just to keep people entertained and just to keep the entire family entertained. So it's this really weird clash of things, which is always fascinating. you know, there's a lot of jokes about being old and dying. You have a lot of jokes by, specifically by the TV family, so Mike TV and his mom, that are kind of based around like alcoholism and just drinking a whole bunch. Her entire intro song, Mrs. TV's entire intro song, is about how many drugs that she takes, and it's just listing a whole bunch of drugs that she takes to try to put up with her disaster of a child. Yeah, lots and lots of that stuff, which is always very like, you know, I get the need and the feeling of needing to not only play to the fact that you are working and writing with children, but then also like you have the parents involved, and the parents need to be entertained too. And I get that, but usually it's you know, certainly a lot more subtle, rather than just being, I drink all the time, here's a million drugs that I take. Yeah, just a very, very interesting thing. Yeah, I think that you know, the musical itself isn't all that interesting. The book isn't all that interesting. You know, I think that really the only thing to discuss within the actual show is this kind of like, you know, what is the actual main villain archetype character that exists here, right? Who is actually dealing with what here? And you know, I think part of it then the shows that it's not, it is such a children's book that there is no actual, you know, clearly defined struggle. But then also, like, you know, you can argue that it is, you know, man versus society in a whole bunch of different ways. Man versus man versus self, right? And you can argue it for both Charlie and for Wonka and all of these things. But yeah, it's just so, I mean, it's so wild that like the way that it's set up is that the first act is meeting all of the winners of the golden tickets. And so like it is like an hour, 15 minutes, hour and a half of just the setup to the big, you know, Wonka experience and the introduction of the golden tickets, and then introducing the 4 other characters that we're going to meet, who they all get one song, and then they all meet back together and get, you know, an 8 count or a 16 count, and that's like the first act, and it just drags on for so long, and gets nothing accomplished. And then the second act is like, oh, here's all the stuff that you remember from, you know, the films, which is the entire actual factory sequence and everything. Yeah. You know, I always, you know, find it very interesting to try to gauge and look at what audience reactions are. And in a musical that's designed to be kind of goofy and comical in a lot of ways, there was 2 events and 2 things that were always the biggest laughs throughout every single night. And it's the same issue that I had with Rocky, right? Of where the 2 biggest things, the 2 things that got the most laughs. One of them I very clearly understand, of where Veruca gets torn apart. Then they have a little meeting of Wonka, Mike TV, Charlie and the Family, and then they go off, and the way it worked, or the way it works in the musical, is that like they go anyways, and then move on. And then Charlie and Grandpa Joe have like a little aside on stage of like, I don't know, did this happen when you were a security guard here? Kind of deal. And in the one that occurs after Veruca dies, Grandpa Joe calls Veruca a pain in the ass. And like just verbatim, just like, yeah, she was a pain in the ass. And then I always got them like by far the most laughs every night, which is understandable, right? It is, you know, you're setting up expectations for it to be a children's show. If there's going to be any adult humor, it's going to be a little more subtle. And then they just come out right out and just, oh yeah, she was a pain in the ass. Let's move on. You know, I expected that to get a lot of laughs. The other thing that got the most laughs every single night was during the first act, you have this kind of weird thing that's occurring with Chocolate News, and this television channel that is tracking the golden ticket winners, which is how then we get to meeting all the golden ticket winners. And you have the two newscasters that eventually get into the same space, and there's a sexual comment that gets made by the female newscaster, and the male newscaster says, you know, hey, we're still live. And then it's just kind of like this awkward moment that exists. And then we had blogged it so that the female newscaster then kind of like rushed away, in a very just like awkward manner. And that was always the thing that always got the second most laughs every night. And, you know, it's the same thing that I had with Rocky, of like, it is, I won't say the exact same thing with Rocky, but it is very much this thing of like setting up women roles to like be preyed upon from an audience point of view, of where, like, you know, it's the misogynistic take of this kind of humor where we get to make fun of women, because if it was I would argue that if the newscaster situation was switched, or if, you know, you could even consider that the Veruca, if Veruca was a boy character instead of a young girl character, that those instances would be looked at a little bit differently. Especially the newscaster one would definitely not have laughs. It would be like an, oh God, this is horrendous type deal. But it gets played off as, oh, it's funny because it's a woman doing it, and women aren't supposed to do X, Y, Z. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Anything else to say with the show? It was also very interesting because our Veruca, poor little Veruca, broke her foot on like 3 or 4 hours before the second week of shows, and so like she was on a scooter for that weekend, and then she was in a cast for the last weekend, and so it was this very fun thing of all of her stuff ended up having 3 different versions of choreo for it, that all got learned to the last second, because it was well, we're gonna do what we can with what we got. And so like the first weekend was the original choreo, and then it was her on a scooter, and what she could do on a scooter, and then the last weekend was her in a walking boot. But yeah, what a time that was. But yeah, that was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and very soon here I'm gonna be going to run auditions for the next show. So yeah.